From slaves to a nation. Let's have a look at what happened between the Exodus and the first kings of Israel. So the Exodus has happened. The Israelites have been in the wilderness for 40 years. We start our story with a bit of sad news. Moses has died. We can read he died at the age of 120 years old. However, with Moses' death, God tells Joshua he can now move into the promised land and conquer it. As the story continues, we can see that the promised land is by no means empty. There are many other nations living and thriving off this land. The Israelites were going to need God's help to be able to overcome this land, but first they would have to re-establish a practice they had let lapse during their wandering. Circumcision. Israel had wandered 40 years in the wilderness because they were not faithful in their covenant with God. It is not surprising then that during that period they had failed to continue the practice of circumcision, which was the symbol of their covenant. Therefore, after Joshua had led his people through the waters of the Jordan, a type of baptism, onto the sacred ground that had been denied their fathers, the Lord required them to reinstitute the physical token of the covenant. No more manna. This event marks a major turning point for Israel. For the first time in 40 years, the children of Israel were on their own. Now they were to stand forth in maturity and from their own labour eat the bread of the land. Considering that the manna had appeared every day but the Sabbath for 40 years, or more than 12,000 times, it truly was the end of a remarkable era. The story of the fall of Jericho we know well. God used the children of Israel to exploit the city's weakness and give his people their first victory. They were going to need many, many more before the promised land was theirs. Unfortunately, their victories did not continue straight away. We then see they send men to defeat the city of Ai, but that the Israelites end up being turned around and 36 of their men killed, as they were pursued by the men of Ai. Joshua gets pretty upset about this and asks God, why? God responds to this in verse 11. Israel hath sinned, and they have also transgressed my covenant which I commanded them, for they have even taken of the accursed thing, and have also stolen and dissembled also, and they've even put it among their own stuff. Therefore the children of Israel could not stand before their enemies, but turned their backs before their enemies, because they were accursed. Neither will I be with you any more, except you destroy the accursed from among you. Now, we need to keep in mind that Israel had just gone through a cleansing process and reinstated their covenant with God. The death penalty may seem pretty harsh, but in this case here, due to the nature and the timing of the crime, the fact that Israel had just been purified and now someone had come along and unpurified it, I guess, Achan needed to be completely cleaned from Israel so that they could again be pure in the eyes of God. Well, they did that. They found Achan and they killed him. And then they were all good. Joshua uses an ambush and takes Ai, slaying all its inhabitants. Moses had stated that once they had entered the land, they needed to place stones on which the law was written at Mount Ebal, which was a mount at the very centre of the promised land, at the heart of the land. Joshua proceeds to Mount Ebal and does this. Now we can see that the children of Israel have been purified, reinstated their covenant, and set up God's law over the land. If we take the verse here and we apply it with Jeremiah 31 verse 33, which states, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, we can see that God has done the same to us. The promised land now has the law smack in the centre of it, or in the heart of it. All that is left was for Joshua to take the remaining nations. In chapter 10 and 11 of the book of Joshua, we see Joshua fight and conquer the land of Canaan. In chapter 10, the Israelites defeat Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, Gezer, Eglon, Makkedah, Libnah, and Debir. In chapter 11, they head north and defeat the remaining nations of Hazar, Madon, Shimron, Akshaph, the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Hivites, and Mizpeh, from Halak unto Baghdad. Now that all the nations of Canaan have been conquered, we can read in Joshua chapter 11, 13 and 18 that the promised land is divided amongst the tribes of Israel. Finally, after many years of war, the children of Israel had received their inheritance under the faithful efforts of Joshua. We now look at the book of Judges. Israel continues to conquer Canaan after the death of Joshua, but fails to properly drive out the Canaanites as God commanded. Those that remain behind turn Israel towards the worship of their gods, especially Baal and Ashtaroth. This breaks Israel's covenant. God steps back and lets Israel learn from its mistakes, leaving them with no leader. The last 5 chapters of Judges actually take place during one of these times, and they're not pretty. Israel becomes a barbaric nation ruled by whomever the biggest bully on the playground happens to be. There's rape, murder, genocide and mass kidnappings aplenty in these chapters. Once God allows Israel to be conquered by oppressors, they realize how much they need him, so they turn from their idols and ask for his help again. He sends it in the form of warriors and champions called judges. Each time God sends a judge, he or she leads Israel to battle against its enemies, and with heavenly help they restore peace and prosperity. But like clockwork, as soon as the judge dies, Israel turns to idolatry again. This happens with a few minor judges, Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, before the first heavy hitter steps up to the plate. Deborah, the only female judge, is a prophetess who, along with her general Barak, defeats a Canaanite king and his general, Sisera. She and Barak are so happy about this that they sing a victory song that lasts a whole chapter. Then they die and the people fall to pieces again, worshipping the other gods. They get conquered and come crawling back to God for help. This time he calls a man named Gideon to deliver Israel. We know the story of Gideon well, so I'll summarise to make it shorter. God uses Gideon to scare the pants off the Midianites and win a great victory with only 300 men. But we see what happens again after Gideon dies. Israel continues the vicious cycle through several more judges, until we arrive at the story of Samson, which again we know a lot about. But to keep it short, superhuman strength, a fierce temper, potential animal abuse, a weakness for woman, passion, deceit, it's got it all. Another example of God using a judge to deliver his people. But it still isn't working for the Israelites. The next book after Judges is the story of Ruth. This is a short book, but worth noting in our recollection of events. It takes place sometime during the period of the Judges. The author of this book is unknown. Let's run through a couple key points about this book. Ruth marries Naomi's son. After a while, Naomi's husband dies, along with Ruth's husband, Naomi's son. So Naomi decides to move back to Bethlehem. After much ado, she lets Ruth come with her. There, Ruth starts gleaning fields and captures the heart of a man named Boaz. Long story short, they fall in love. After a couple small hurdles, they get married and they have a child named Obed. So why is this story so important? Well, Obed is the grandfather of King David, the second king of Israel. We now move to the book of 1 Samuel, meaning we're drawing closer to the end of this animation. Samuel's mother, Hannah, vowed that if God enabled her to bear a child, she would dedicate him to God with the vow of a Nazarite. She then bore Samuel. At the age of 4, she handed Samuel over to Eli, the high priest. Samuel grew, and a few years later, God speaks to Samuel and tells him to deliver some bad news to Eli about himself and his sons' lives. Not long after this, the Philistines came and attacked God's people. In this attack, Eli's sons were killed, and upon hearing the news, Eli also died. The Israelites cried out to God for help. Samuel stepped in, told them to be rid of their false gods and idol worshipping, and with Samuel's leadership and by God's power, the Philistines were overcome. Samuel was recognized as the judge of Israel. However, like Eli's sons, Samuel also had 2 sons that sinned before God. This led the elders of Israel to demand a king, as we can read in 1 Samuel 8 verse 1 to 5. This made Samuel pretty angry, so he prayed to God. God responded by telling him to select a king, but to warn the people what they could expect from having a man among them as a king instead of himself. And this is where we leave our little story as we arrive at the beginning of the story of the first kings of Israel.